third annual Sentencing Commission Symposium. 2 years ago, we started this and had a program on pretrial release. Last year, we talked about sex offender registries and sort of different ideas about that. In the first two programs, we were able to bring to this room some nationally regarded speakers on those topics. And today's no different. This program really had its origin in a statute that was passed last session of the legislature, which directed the Sentencing Commission to do an examination of sentencing disparities in the state of Connecticut. And we are in the process of designing a study to do just that, which hopefully will result in a report that will be available publicly and may hopefully advance our thinking on this important topic. And so because we're working on this disparity study, we thought that would be a good topic for our symposium this year. And so we were able to have some really top-notch speakers who are going to share their wisdom and their knowledge with us today. Hopefully may not have a lot of, this is not an issue where there's like a 1 + 1 = 2 sort of answer, but it's nevertheless a really important topic that hopefully all of us should think about because it really affects the day-to-day work that we do. So I want to start, though, by thanking the people that have worked on this. First, the University of Connecticut School of Law. They have been extremely generous to the Sentencing Commission in allowing us to use this beautiful room. And I will say, just as an aside, the law schools in our state, UConn, Yale, and Quinnipiac, have been really quite generous with the Sentencing Commission generally. We've had a lot of help from them in research and things like that. I want to publicly thank them. I want to thank the members of the Sentencing Commission who worked very hard to advance policies, criminal justice policy. Our basic model is to take stakeholders from the entire spectrum of the criminal justice system in our state and try to pool that wisdom to come up with good ideas. So I'm very grateful to the work that they do. And the staff of the Sentencing Commission and the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy, they have been instrumental in our work, and I want to thank our Executive Director, Alex Sarkoff, for his tremendous work day in, day out in advancing our mission. Van Auger and Cynthia Semakar, who's actually done very, on the staff, worked very hard behind the scenes to make all this stuff happen. And our sponsors, the Center for Public Policy and Social Research under the O'Neill Endowed Chair at Central Connecticut State University. They're a sponsor of this program. The Commission on Women and Children, Seniors, Equity and Opportunity, the Connecticut Division of Public Defender Services, and the Connecticut Division of Criminal Justice. They've all been generous sponsors to this program. I'd like to turn the program now over to University of Connecticut Law School professor Jamelia Morgan, who's making a couple of remarks on behalf of the school.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Judge Devlin. I appreciate the introduction. Welcome, all of you, to Connecticut School of Law. It's really rewarding to see the room full of dedicated stakeholders and individuals working on improving our criminal legal system here in Connecticut. I know many of you have been working tirelessly on this issue for a number of years. I'm newly returned back to the state after some time away, looking forward to the conversations for today, and have the honor of just welcoming you with a few remarks. So it probably goes without saying to the people in this room that we have a mass incarceration problem here in the United States. Over 2.3 million people are held behind bars, and that sheer volume of individuals in American prisons vastly exceeds the total prison population for most advanced democracies. It's roughly 25% of the world's incarcerated people in a country that has almost 5% of the global population. The 2.3 million figure is, in fact, not the full picture, as it doesn't include the approximately 4.5 million people on community supervision, probation, and parole. As I know many of you in the room are aware, that's why we are here today. Racial disparities and inequality plague our criminal legal system. I see Marc in the room, and I'm referencing many of the work and reports in my data in studying this issue. But today, people of color make up 37% of the US population collectively, but 67% of our prisons. A 2014 report by the Sentencing Project found that although Blacks and Latinos together comprise just 30% of the population, they alone are 60% of the prison population. I think often our conversations on mass incarceration focus exclusively on men, and I wanted to lift some of the data with respect to women. Over the past quarter century, there has been a surge of involvement in women in the criminal legal system. Though many more men obviously are imprisoned than women, the rate of growth for female imprisonment has been twice as high as that of men since 1980. There are currently 1.2 million people women under supervision in our criminal legal system. Today, our female prison population stands nearly 8 times higher than it did in 1980. The rate in particular for African American women was twice that of the imprisonment for white women. For Latina women, their rate was 1.4 times that of white women. So here in Connecticut, we know, again, the data from the Sentencing Project suggests that we have racial disparities in our criminal legal system as well. According to a 2016 report, Latinos are imprisoned at a rate that is almost 4 times that of whites. When compared to other states, Connecticut ranks 5th behind Vermont, Oklahoma, Ohio, and Delaware in the rate of incarceration for Black males. So despite these troubling statistics and figures, there is cause for optimism, although there's much work to be done. I know many of you have been involved in the advocacy efforts to increase transparency and justice in our system. And we're in a moment where the state is poised and ready to address these cruel and devastating legacies of race and class-based inequality. At UConn Law, we're committed to educating the next generation of lawyers to address these issues and push for justice, greater public accountability and transparency, community engagement and leadership, and ultimately reimagining safety and responses to harm and conflict. So I want to thank you all and welcome you to a day which I know will be informative and transformative, and engage us all in this conversation on how we can work towards more just outcomes here in Connecticut. Thank you all.
Okay, so our first speaker and our keynote speaker is Marc, who's the executive director of the Sentencing Project, which is a national nonprofit organization that does research and advocacy on criminal justice policy. Marc has thought deeply and written widely on this topic. We're very fortunate to have him here today. So let's welcome Marc.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Sometimes in the introductions I get, I've written several books, and people often mention my book, Race to Incarcerate, because it gets at the issues that we're going to be discussing today. And you know, when that happens, I've learned to appreciate how people can get things right or get things wrong. When the book was first published, I was giving a talk at one of the bookstores in Washington, and a newsletter went out promoting the talk. It said, Marc will speak about his new book, Race to Incinerate. And, so we can talk about those issues later too, but I think we want to talk about prison issues and what that looks like today. I'm particularly delighted to be here in Connecticut. Over the years, I've had number of opportunities to come up here and engage with policymakers and practitioners. I've tried to follow developments in the state from a distance as best I can. You probably know this, but you know, Connecticut in many respects is one of the national leaders in rethinking its criminal justice system. I know it doesn't always feel like everything is going right, but by some important metrics, there's some real accomplishments here that you collectively have put together. Most significantly, from my perspective, is just looking at the number of people and the rate of incarceration. Nationally, we're at a moment now where there's a great deal of discussion about over-incarceration, how can we reduce prison populations in a reasonable way. And Connecticut is one of about a half dozen states that have made not just trivial changes, but very substantial shifts. I believe the prison population today is down about a third from where it was maybe 2 decades ago, and that's a pretty big chunk of a difference or so. Prison populations are down in most states around the country, but in most places it's very low. It's in the single digits or so. So it's not an easy thing to find a 1/3 reduction, and it takes a lot of coordinated work and thought in doing that. For the issues we're here to talk about today, it also means there are fewer people of all racial, ethnic groups in prison in Connecticut today than there were 20 years ago. There are fewer whites, fewer African Americans, fewer Latinos, and others as well. And yet, despite all this progress, the degree of racial disparity in Connecticut and around the country is still not very different than it was 20 years ago. So fewer people in prison, I think that's very good. You've done it in a reasonable way, but the racial disparities still persist. So I want to try to talk this morning about what do we know about where did those disparities come from, what does it mean in terms of sentencing policy and practice in particular, and what could we be doing to try to address that, to try to reduce those from what numbers that we're seeing today. Let me start with a quick story about a friend of mine. My friend and his wife are parents for 3 teenage kids, 2 girls and a boy. And their teenage son, some time ago, started acting like a teenage boy. He was staying out late at night. He was smashing up the family car once in a while. His grades in school were suffering. There may have been some alcohol or drug use going on. It was nothing terrible, but they were getting concerned about what was happening. And one night they get a call from the police to come down and pick up their son at the police station. He's been arrested for shoplifting from a local convenience store. And over the course of the next 2 weeks or so, my friend and his wife are engaged in discussions, first with police, then with the prosecutor assigned to the case. And what they said to them was, our son's been having some challenges these days. He knows it, we know it. We found a social worker who is able to work with him. We think that she can help him get through this difficult period that he's going through right now. And the prosecutor basically said, well, that sounds like a reasonable course of action. It's his first arrest. It's not a serious crime. I think we can drop the charges and you go deal with that as a family. So they go off and the young man starts meet with the social worker, and things do start to get better. He's doing better in school. He has a better relationship with his parents these days, and it looks like he's going to go on and become a good middle-class American and have a nice amount of opportunity. But I would imagine the same night that my friend's son was arrested, there was another young man arrested not very far away whose parents may not have had the private resources to bring a social worker in. They may not have had the negotiating skills to deal with the prosecutor in the case. And that young man is not going to go to prison on his first shoplifting charge. He'll probably get probation or community service work, something like that. But 6 or 12 months from now, he gets arrested for a larceny this time, and all of a sudden, he starts to be looking like what we sometimes call a habitual offender. And he's starting to go down a very different path than my friend's son is going down. So when we think about issues of race and incarceration, we're really looking, I think, the intersection of race and social class, access to resources, and what do families, what do communities, bring to these issues. The criminal justice system lays out a certain way of doing things, but it's overlaid with all these other kinds of powers, privileges, disadvantages, and the like. So I think we want to keep that in mind as we think about how do we address disparities and what is the complexity of looking at that. Now, the big picture, if we want to go back some time, imagine we're back in 1954, the year of the historic Brown versus Board of Education decision. On the day of that decision, there were about 100,000 African Americans behind bars in prisons and jails in the United States, 100,000. Since then, we've had more than a half century of opening up of social and economic opportunity for people, many of whom had not experienced that before. If we look at the criminal justice system, it's not unusual to see people of color in leadership positions around the system. We've seen great changes in society. We have a long way to go, but clearly we've made much progress from where we were in 1954. And despite all that progress, that figure of 100,000 African Americans behind bars is now about 700,000 behind bars. So how do we understand this time of changing, growing economic opportunity, and yet if we look at the criminal justice system, the outcomes are much, much worse than we saw 70 years ago? Well, for some people, the answer is very simple. They would say, if you do the crime, you do the time, and it's all about involvement in crime. If people would stop doing crimes, that would take care of the problem. So what do we know about that? Well, if we look at FBI data on arrests nationally, African Americans constitute about 30% of arrests for property crimes, 37% of arrests for violent crimes. Both of these are considerably higher than the African American proportion of the population overall. But we don't have to dig very deep to see that what might appear to be a racial effect on the surface is really one much more so of social class, of poverty, and particularly concentrated poverty that's experienced in so many African American communities and the disadvantages that come along with that. Nothing about disadvantaged poverty means that individuals aren't responsible for their behaviors. Individuals of all kinds need to be accountable, but at the same time, if we want to diagnose where the problems come from, what we can do about it, we need to be very cognizant of this and how these things play out. So we have this sort of broader social structure, economic structure, if we want to think of it that way. But we also know that policy and practice within the justice system doesn't necessarily cause racial disparity, but it can exacerbate, it can magnify racial disparities too. And this comes about through decision-making by practitioners, comes about in how we allocate resources, comes about through implicit bias, unintended racism, if we want to think of it that way. Not necessarily from bad people doing bad things, but frequently people doing things that they believe are reasonable, that they believe are race neutral, but frequently can have very racially disparate effects nonetheless. So let's look at what that looks like. If we start at the level of law enforcement, one of the key issues been raised in recent years has been the whole practice of stop and frisk used by many major police departments. New York City was probably the prime national example where one point more than 600,000 stops were being made by police each year. 90% of them were for people of color, mostly young people. The vast majority of those stops did not lead to an arrest for any kind of offense. About 5 years ago, this litigation in federal court found that the practice was unconstitutional, and the city was ordered to essentially stop unnecessary stop and frisk. Since that time, the number of stops is down more than 95% from that 600,000 mark. The previous mayor of New York, some police officials, and others had warned of a coming crime wave if stop and frisk were stopped. They viewed it as a very important part of their crime-fighting strategy. All the data we've seen since then shows there's no adverse effect on crime. Crime trends go up and down, little bits here and there by the years. There's nothing dramatic. And New York City still maintains that very low rate of crime, certainly compared with where it was several decades ago. So we see this racially disparate policy and practice that in turn had no public safety benefits. We see as well, I think, how does implicit bias play out in the system? And again, let's assume these are well-meaning practitioners and policymakers putting in place policy they believe are race neutral, they believe are necessary for public safety. So a couple of examples in the juvenile justice system. Some years ago, the Annie Casey Foundation, many of you know, was doing quite a bit of work on juvenile detention, technical assistance to jurisdictions to reduce the number of kids in detention, and also to address racial disparities in detention too. So in their work in Portland, Oregon, Multnomah County, the county was using a risk assessment instrument to make determinations of which kids need to be detained, which ones could be sent home. One of the questions on the risk assessment instrument was, does this young person have a good family structure? Now, some of us were fortunate enough to grow up in homes that had a good family structure. Some of us were not so fortunate to have that. When the evaluators looked at that, they said, why don't we change that question to, is there a responsible adult who can look out for this young person? That responsible adult might be a teacher, might be a minister, might be a basketball coach, someone else, but someone the court could depend on maintaining contact and supervision. And once they did that, the number of African American kids in particular was down dramatically following that. So very simple change, just taking into account that, again, policies and practices might feel race neutral, can often have very racially disparate effects. Another case in the juvenile system, researchers were looking at the pre-sentence reports that were being sent to juvenile court judges from the probation office. And they looked at the narrative section of the report, basically the part where the probation officer is describing who this young person is to give the judge a more fleshed out sense of his or her potential and issues in the community and things like that. When they broke down the narrative reports by race, the white youth were typically described as having what we might think of as environmental problems. They weren't getting along with their family, they were acting out in school, behavioral issues of various kinds, things like that. The black kids were far more likely to be described as having antisocial personality. Now, what are the implications here? Well, if you're having environmental problems, there are things we could try to do about that. We could get a counselor to help you and your family get along better. We could have a tutor helping you in school get through your courses. We could try to deal with some of this acting out behavior because we know there are strategies to address that. But if you're somebody who's described as having antisocial personality, we can't very well give you a new personality and say we fixed you now or anything like that. So again, maybe it's subtle, maybe it's not so subtle, but how these images come across, how these perspectives, how this kind of labeling comes across is going to tell us something about differential outcomes in the system too. Then if we move into the area of sentencing, policy, and practice, certainly the drug war of recent decades has received a great deal of attention, lots of dialogue now, lots of changes starting to take place. Much of that dialogue and attention was around law enforcement priorities, Frequently, the drug war is being waged much more so in low-income communities of color, even though that we know that drug use and abuse cuts across lines of race and class. But it also was a sentencing policy issue as well. The highest profile issue probably was nationally in Congress with the mandatory sentencing penalties for crack cocaine adopted in the mid-1980s by Congress, kind of at the height of the national hysteria, if we want to think about crack cocaine, where these penalties were rushed through Congress in record time with virtually no discussion either on their potential impact, no discussion about alternative measures of dealing with this new drug problem that was emerging at the time. So very predictably, turned out about 80% of the people charged with these very stiff mandatory penalties were African American. It took until 2010, 24 years after the laws were first put in place, that the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine was reduced. Not eliminated, but was reduced significantly, although that law, that change was not made retroactive, which then took until 2018, the First Step Act in Congress being implemented, and that finally made the previous reduction retroactive. So today there are about 2,500 people in federal prison serving very lengthy periods of time for crack cocaine offenses whose sentences are in the process of being reduced as a result of these policy changes after 30 years of being on the books. It's not just the crack cocaine penalties. Every state has policies of so-called drug-free school zones. Basically, drug transactions made near a school zone are punished more severely than your typical drug transaction would be. The idea, of course, is we don't want drug dealers selling drugs to our kids on the playground at lunchtime. But what we learned from much experience is that it turns out that particularly in urban areas which are densely populated, when you draw a radius around the schoolyard, virtually every block in many cities can be considered to be within a school zone. People of color more likely to be concentrated in those urban areas, so very highly brought up on these charges. New Jersey some years ago became concerned about this, did a study of how the school zone law was being implemented. 96% of the people charged with a school zone offense were African American or Latino. Connecticut, I know, is one of the states that looked at this some years ago, gave judges greater discretion in whether the school zone penalties needed to be applied. Other states are starting to do that as well. But again, let's assume it was a well-meaning policy. We don't want drug dealers selling to our kids in school, but without thinking through the potential consequences, what are we setting in place? There are often unintended consequences to many of these policies. Now, how does it come about that some sentencing policies and others affect people of color far more so than whites, and leaving aside levels of involvement in crime which we can control for? Well, some very interesting public opinion, psychological research looking at how people perceive problems and what kinds of responses they then develop. When researchers ask people to estimate what is the proportion of crime that's committed by African Americans, white respondents generally overestimate the actual amount by 20 or 30%, 20 or 30% above what is actually the case. And then a second step to measure degrees of punishment to the extent that respondents view a certain crime as a so-called black crime, that is one disproportionately committed by African Americans, then support for punishment goes up. So you have one crime, people think, that's something black people commit. They don't consciously say, I want to punish black people more, but in effect, that's how it plays out. And the other crime, they think white people commit more. They don't consciously think so, but the punishments that are imposed are less. And there's no reason to believe that legislative bodies are any different than the rest of us in these perceptions and how they play out. So some of these assumptions, again, let's assume it's not evil intent on people, but how do these racial assumptions that are deeply ingrained in all of us, going back hundreds of years, how does this play out in how we allocate punishment for different crimes? We see, I think, in recent decades, an issue I'm particularly concerned about, which has to do with how do we enhance penalties for prior offenses and what the racial effects may be there too. So we have a whole set of policies of habitual offender laws, 3 strikes and you're out laws. Some of these policies have been around for decades. The 3 strikes laws mostly came about in the mid-1990s or so. These are policies that have had a very substantial effect on racial outcomes. Now, judges and prosecutors have long taken into account prior record. That's often a key variable in determining a sentence in addition to the severity of the offense. And we could debate how much that should be taken into account or whatever. But these days, the enhancement itself, the degree to which a sentence is enhanced, is often magnified far more than previously had been. If we look at California's had the most extreme 3 strikes law in the country. Many of you may know the original law specified that your first 2 strikes needed to be serious or violent offenses as defined in the statutes, but your 3rd strike could be any felony in the state of California. So the law was charged as being cruel and unconstitutional in litigation that reached the U.S. Supreme Court in 2003. There were 2 cases before the court. The first one, a man had stolen 3 golf clubs from a sporting goods store. He was wearing baggy pants. He took the clubs, stuck them down his pants, walked out, and he was immediately apprehended and charged. The second one, a man had stolen $153 worth of videotapes from a Kmart store on 2 different occasions. That was his 3rd felony charge as well. So the Supreme Court looked at these cases. The consideration was, were they cruel and unusual? They rejected the argument, and essentially their reasoning was, if this is what the legislature in California believes is necessary to deal with its public safety problems, we don't want to be second-guessing them on that. So the golf club thief was serving out his sentence of 25 to life, and the videotape thief his sentence of 50 to life. That's what those policies have brought us. Now, finally, by 2014, as more of these cases came to light, there was another ballot initiative in California, which basically said the 3rd strike also needed to be serious or violent too, so you couldn't have those golf club cases anymore. But what we see in California is a huge racial effect of 3 strikes laws. Today, African Americans represent 28% of the prison population in California. If we look at 3 strikes cases, they represent 46% of the people serving a life sentence for a 3 strikes crime. Now, why is there a racial effect of 3 strikes laws? It may have something to do with criminal offending. It also may have something to do with law enforcement practices. Certain behaviors in certain communities may be more likely to come to the attention of law enforcement than they do in other communities, or they get handled differently when they first come into the system. We had one intriguing example in federal sentencing some years ago now. At the time, Nancy Gertner was a federal district judge in Boston. now teaches at Harvard Law. She had a case that came before her. The man's name was Mr. Levener. He'd been stopped by police and found to have an illegal gun on him, was charged with that. He was convicted, and when it came time for sentencing, she looked at his prior convictions, and he'd been a resident of Boston most of his life. His prior convictions, several of them evolved from traffic stops. He was stopped by the police for some infraction. They found drugs in the car. He was stopped by the police for another infraction. They found a weapon in the car. Boston's had a long history of racial profiling by law enforcement. Judge Gerdner didn't dispute the validity of these prior convictions, but her reasoning was, as an African-American man driving around in Boston, he was more likely to be stopped by police, more likely to acquire a more serious criminal record than a similarly situated white man driving around Boston. So whereas the sentencing guidelines had called for 6 years based on his offense and prior record, she reduced that to 2.5 years, essentially discounting some of the prior record based on what she believed was a documented history of racial profiling by law enforcement there. So prior record, how does that factor in? And it's not just who's committing crime, but how crimes, which crimes come in the system and how they're handled, all those kinds of developments that we want to be looking at. In the area of sort of sentencing policy and how that affects racial dynamics as well. The Sentencing Project, we've been very engaged in recent years on issues of life imprisonment, decades long, what we view as excessive sentencing. My colleague Ashley Nelson and I published a book last year called The Meaning of Life, in which we look at life sentences and why they're problematic. What has gone largely unknown for a long time is that as we see the growth of the prison system around the country, the number of people serving a life sentence has been exploding in the last 3 decades, to the point today where nationally 1 of every 7 people in prison is serving a life sentence. 1 of every 7, which translates to 206,000 people across the country. To put some perspective on that, there are now more people serving life imprisonment than the entire prison population in 1970, just before the rise of mass incarceration. 2/3 of the people serving life are people of color. Now, the vast majority of people serving life imprisonment have committed serious crimes, violent crimes. Murder and robbery are the most common ones. Yes, they need to be accountable for those crimes. Yes, those crimes are serious crimes. That still doesn't tell us what kinds of punishments are appropriate. At what point might a punishment become excessive, given the balance that we need to achieve between accountability, public safety, fairness, and other objectives. And what we do find in life imprisonment or decades-long sentencing is that there are diminishing returns for public safety. And this comes about for 2 main reasons. First, the one thing criminologists have known for 100 years is that people age out of crime. Crime rates start to rise in the mid-teen years for boys and to some extent for girls too. Any of you who have ever had a teenage boy in the home knows that they sometimes do things that hopefully are not criminal, but are things that you're not happy about. But most of them get over it by their mid-20s, late 20s or so. They grow up, they become adults, they take on other roles. So crime rates start to rise pretty sharply in the mid-teens through the late teens and early 20s, but then overall they start to decline by the mid to late 20s, and certainly by the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the risk to public safety of a person that age is far reduced from that 20 or 25-year-old who might have been convicted of a serious crime. So people age out of crime. So what that means is that for each successive year that we're keeping someone behind bars after the age of, say, 40, we're preventing less and less crime through incapacitation of that person. Now, these are overall findings, so any given individual needs to be individually assessed, of course, and just because the overall findings tell us doesn't mean that there are not some people who are significant threats to public safety at 40, 50, even 60 or beyond, but not very many of them. So we're getting diminishing returns for public safety. At the same time, we're also shifting our resources and how we deal with public safety. We have prisons in this country that essentially have started geriatric wings of their prison. You can see the photographs of men in their 60s and 70s, some of them in wheelchairs, many of them having very serious health problems that are incapacitating them. The cost of incarcerating an elderly person is usually estimated as 2 or 3 times what the average cost of incarceration is for someone in prison. So we're spending enormous resources on a growing elderly population in prison, for which we're preventing very little crime, and those resources are not being used to invest with the 14, 15, 16-year-olds who are beginning to get into that high crime rate years, and for whom we know there are things we could do to invest in strengthening the ability of their families and the communities to deal with the possibility of their getting involved in behaviors that we're concerned about. So we're seeing counterproductive effects, and it raises questions: how long is too long, even for a serious crime? There are also legal standards and human rights standards about excessive sentencing. The American Bar Association, the American Law Institute, both have recommendations and policies that say punishment should be no greater than necessary to achieve societal objectives. No greater than necessary. So that should be the standards that we're looking at to determine how long do people need to stay in prison. So where does that leave us in terms of addressing racial disparities? How do we reduce racial disparities? How do we make it part of our public safety policies and objectives, and how do we do that together? There are some people who would say we could either reduce the prison population or we could increase public safety, but we can't do both together. I believe that's precisely wrong. I think over-incarcerating people almost always results in less public safety, less confidence in the justice system, and we can reduce incarceration, reduce racial disparity, and at the same time increase and promote public safety. For a start, I think we know this needs to be done in a systemic way. The criminal justice system is comprised of actors making decisions at each stage of the process, and decisions made at one stage can easily be undone by the actor at the next stage. So unless there's a jurisdiction commitment to addressing racial disparities, it's too easy for 1 or 2 practitioners to just upset the whole apple cart. We know, too, of course, that we need to be able to evaluate where racial disparity comes from and what kind of progress we're making in dealing with it. So we need to collect data, we need to evaluate it, we need to have oversight so we have some idea of how to measure what we're doing. This has come up a lot in jurisdictions where law enforcement agencies are trying to deal with charges of racial profiling. Sometimes we hear that leadership is saying this is a few bad apples in the department, but overall we have a department that's not engaging with these practices. That may or may not be the case, but we don't know unless we have the data. So many departments are trying to get the data now, trying to see where these charges of profiling come from. Is this, in fact, a few bad apples? Is it more systemic? But we need to evaluate that as a community to come to some conclusions about what the problem is. We also need to, I think, be proactive in how we think about sentencing policies in particular. Connecticut here, too, is one of a half dozen states that has adopted policy, in Connecticut's case, about a decade ago, racial impact statement legislation. Similar to environmental impact legislation, which was established because we know that there are unintended consequences. When you build a dam in a national forest, some things may happen to the wildlife there that we wouldn't have anticipated. So we now make those studies before we go ahead and build the dam or wherever else we may be doing. Similarly, when legislative policies are enacting sentencing penalties, as with crack cocaine, there may be racial effects that are not being considered by the legislative body. So we should be talking about those projected effects before the legislation is adopted, not 24 years after it's put in place, as was done with crack cocaine. So Connecticut was actually the second state to adopt such a policy. My impression is it's not being used as widely as it might be or so, but you may know more about it than I do. But the idea behind it essentially is we need to have the conversation so that we can project what the impact may be, and if we think it's a racially disparate impact, are there other means of addressing public safety that don't produce those kinds of racial effects? Now, another area I think we need to look at gets back to the story of my friend whose parents were able to avoid the use of the justice system for his shoplifting charge, and that's access to resources. It seems to me what we're talking about is how do we level the playing field. The idea of racial disparity in prisons, to my mind, is not to lock up more white people, but to say, how do we give indigent people, poor people, people of color, the same opportunities to get best outcomes they can in the justice system? So that raises issues of cash bail. It raises issue of the quality of indigent defense. It's the opportunity to have treatment alternatives to incarceration. Again, I know that people in the state have worked on these issues a long time, but I think we need to keep looking at how does the system allocating resources, does everybody get the same and a fair chance at the best outcome given the case they're working with? Finally, in terms of sentencing, are there policies being considered or on the books that, again, appear racially neutral but may have bias built into them in terms of how the system works? We want to be looking in particular, I think, at the impact of prison terms. Yes, people may have been convicted fairly, but does excessive sentencing exacerbate racial disparities and do it in a way that doesn't have a public safety objective, but needlessly is exacerbating racial disparities? We have one encouraging development along these lines in California. California, as many of you know, in recent years, has had some major shifts in its prison population and policies, begun in many ways in 2011 when the Supreme Court found the entire prison system to be unconstitutional because of the declining health standards in the prison, because of tremendous overcrowding, the failure to address people's legitimate health needs. So the state was ordered to make a very substantial reduction in the prison population. There were a number of initiatives put in place. One of them was a ballot initiative called Proposition 47. What that did was it reclassified a half dozen low-level property and drug offenses from felonies to misdemeanors, so that if you were convicted, you could no longer be sent to state prison, but you'd be kept in the community. You might get a jail sentence, you might get community supervision, and the like. And then it was made retroactive, so some of those prior felonies were reduced to misdemeanors too. Study just coming out now is looking at, we've seen the population reduction that came out of that. The studies have been done on crime rates and rearrest, shows that in the first year of the policy being put into place, there was a slight uptick in auto theft, which then reduced. There was no significant impact on crime. But it's also reducing racial disparity too, and much of that, again, is getting at this prior record. If you have a prior felony record, it's going to up the sentence on your next conviction. So if you reduce the prior felonies, you're reducing some of that racial disparity too. So we can make some changes in sentencing that have an impact like this. Let me just close with another image from the sort of heyday of the wars on crime in the 1980s and 1990s and what it means for us thinking about these issues. You probably remember in the mid-1990s, there was a small group of well-connected academics and political ideologues, I would say, who coined this new term of super predators. John DiIulio is a professor. Politics was one of the people behind this, and they talked about this coming generation of super predators, and their prediction was this was a group of sort of 5-year-olds at the time, but by the time they became teenagers, they would be the wildest, most out of control, most dangerous group of teenagers that this country had ever seen. They didn't generally specify directly, but it was quite clear they were talking about young black boys and this coming generation of super predators. And they had op-ed articles in the Wall Street Journal, and they testified in Congress. It was very high-level attention they got for this contention. Well, it turned out they weren't very good as being social scientists, because not long after they predicted the super predator wave, crime rates started coming down. They came down for adults, they came down for juveniles, they came down for black juveniles all across the board. So their predictions had no basis in reality. But imagine that we were back there at the time, and imagine that we had some legitimate reason to believe that this group of 5-year-old boys was going to be a high-risk population 10 years from now. What would we do if we had that knowledge? It seems to me we have two choices. First, we could start building prisons as quickly as possible, so we'd be ready to lock them all up by the time they turn 15 or 16 or so. That's one strategy. Second would be to say, you know, this is a problem, this is a real concern. The only good news is that we have a 10-year window of opportunity before they become this high-rate offending group. So what can we do over the period of 10 years to strengthen the ability of their families, their communities, to deal with the issues that contribute to criminal behavior? How can we address this so that they don't become this high-risk population? Well, it seems to me if it's somebody else's children we're talking about, too many people are willing to take that first option. Let's build more prisons, and then we've resolved the problem. If it's our own kids, if it's our family members, if it's our neighbors' kids, we're much more likely to say, let's try that second solution. Let's see what we can do to avoid this terrible outcome of high crime and high incarceration rates. So it seems to me what we need to be doing is to get to a point where every kid is our kid, where we look out for other people's kids the same way we would for our own, where we advocate for them, where we talk about how resources are allocated. And if we treat everyone's kid as if they're our own, I think we have a much better public safety policy, and we have much stronger, much healthier communities. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for a few questions, and people will be roaming around, so just please raise your hands.
Hello. You talked a little bit about along the lines of intersectionality. And I was wondering if you guys went on like a deeper level of touching on like sexuality and gender within the prison system and the way people who are especially transitioning and going into the prison system, how they are treated within our criminal justice system, especially people of color.
Yeah. It's an important question. You know, I don't pretend to have a lot of expertise on that. My general sense is some prison systems are doing a better job than others in recognizing this is important both for the individuals, important for the system to understand this. You know, I think we've seen waves of change coming to corrections. You know, we think of HIV, AIDS crisis, 1980s, and far too many correction systems handled that very poorly at first, and it's not perfect today, but it's much better than it was, and I think we're at a similar moment now with this set of issues you raise. So, yeah, we all need to be engaged in helping to work that through. Why don't people identify themselves when you ask a question, please?
Hi, good morning. My name is Cindy Prizio with One Standard of Justice. Just as a case to report, restorative justice is working to various degrees in terms of, you know, school to prison pipeline, RJ practices and principles, and also restorative justice as a replacement for the adversarial legal system in New York State and in Washington, D.C., and Colorado, and not excluding any types of offenses. I was just hoping you'd offer some insight and your opinions on that.
Yeah, you know, restorative justice obviously is a very intriguing way to think about crime differently, conflict differently, and the like, and, you know, it's really exploded in many ways across the country. I think one critique that we'd seen for some time about restorative justice was it's fine for those easy cases about, you know, the teenager causes some property damage, but it's never going to be a replacement or legitimate alternative for more serious cases. You know, and in that regard, little book promotion for a friend. Some of you know about a program in Brooklyn, New York called Common Justice. It's run by a very fascinating woman called Danielle Sered, and she has a new book out called Until We Reckon. Their project is deliberately focused on cases of violent assaults, essentially, in that neighborhood in Brooklyn, and to very consciously both say that restorative justice does offer a very legitimate means of dealing with conflict, and she argues very forcefully in the book that it's far more effective in most of their cases than she believes incarceration would be, which only makes the problems worse in many cases, both in reducing the public safety concerns as well as promoting healing in the community too. So it's very intriguing. I think to some extent can serve as a model for other places where we can look at that.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, Mark. So you
Introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, Trevor Johnson. I'm with the Judicial Branch, Adult Probation. You spoke a little bit about sort of these kind of race-neutral approaches. And so for the first 350 years in this country for African Americans, we had very race-specific applications of justice. And then during the next 50 years, we have this race-neutral approach, yet disparate outcomes are still rather horrific. The solutions have to be race-specific. And so it's not enough to promote race-neutral and things that we can achieve some progress if we don't accept the harm that we've done and the responsibility that we have to repair the harm that we've caused. That's an issue of justice, not necessarily criminal justice. And so I think moving forward, and I've loved your work, you know, and I've said this to you on many occasions. You provide one of the greatest repositories of data that has been vetted and that speaks to us in ways to challenge us to action. More importantly, the solutions have to, in some way, embrace the very people who've been harmed the most. That is race-specific, not race-neutral.
Yeah, very well said.
Good morning, Jamelia Morgan here at UConn. I wanted to just hear your thoughts on two things. One, our current opioid epidemic and your thoughts on drug policy, sentencing policy in particular in that area. And then also like the rise of people with disabilities in our prison systems, disproportionately psychiatric disabilities, but also physical disabilities for the reasons that you stated earlier, given our aging prison population.
Yeah. Well, the opioid crisis is a terrible problem, of course, and it's very frightening and the like, and we're not doing a great job dealing with it so far. Many people have raised intriguing challenges and saying, look how we dealt with the crack cocaine epidemic in the 1980s and how we're dealing with the opioid crisis today. Crack cocaine, it was all about punishment. Opioids, it's much more so about treatment and prevention. And what explains that difference? Well, the easiest thing to look at is race in the face of the person with the problem. It was an African-American face, whether or not that was entirely representative, but that was the public face and with crack, and now it's a white working class face, although it's more mixed there as well. We'd like to think maybe we've learned something from the excesses of the drug war of the 80s and 90s, and maybe that's part of the reason we're shifting, but it's hard to discount the role of race in how we do that. We're still repeating many of the same mistakes we made in drug wars going back 100 years or so. As we speak in Congress, they're looking at legislation around fentanyl, which is, again, a terrible problem. Drug problems have never been solved by adding more mandatory sentences. People know that these things are illegal, and if it had a great deterrent effect, we would have seen it by now, and we're not seeing that. So we're seeing the same things over and over again there. In terms of disabilities, mental health issues in particular, it's bad news and good news, I would say. The bad news is, if you look at histories of mental health, mental illness among incarcerated populations, it's pretty shocking, pretty disturbing. It doesn't mean we get a free pass just because you have mental health history, but it does tell us something about what's going on. And you don't need to be a psychologist to realize that taking somebody who's got serious mental health issues and putting them in a cage in a prison is not going to do very much good. The good news part of it is, I think, among practitioners over the last couple of decades, there's growing recognition that too many people are entering in the system related to mental health status, and maybe we should treat this differently. So, you get programs in Memphis, Tennessee was one of the first ones, I believe, where law enforcement agencies now partner with local mental health organizations, and when they get a call for service and there's reason to believe there may be mental health issues involved, the police go out along with the social worker, and together they try to assess the situation, decide, is this a criminal justice issue or is this a mental health issue, and try to deal with it that way. I hear people over the years, I'm sure you all do too, defense attorneys, judges, others say, there's something wrong with this guy. I don't know what it is, but there's something that's off. And they don't have the training or the expertise to do that assessment. And far too often, people just get shuttled through the system without any kind of intervention to figure that out. So again, there are now mental health courts in some places. There's more expert assistance in some jurisdiction, but still the scale of people with these kinds of issues is far too high, and criminal justice is not a good place to deal with most of them.
Hi, good morning. My name is Saouda Barak. I'm retired Chief Probation Officer 2 and presently with Believe in Me Empowerment Corporation, nonprofit out of New Haven. I have a question and some comments. We talk about the issues impacting the African American community. We're really talking about a increase in our prison industrial system, our bail bond industrial system, going back a century. And until we address those issues, we're not going to really make any real change in our country. The other issue that I see California and some other states addressing has to do with generational trauma. California, under the leadership of Dr. Nadine Burke, is talking about changing the conversation, that we're really talking about a public health crisis, not a criminal justice crisis. And I think it's important that we begin to look at how do we take money in Connecticut away from criminal justice and start putting that money into public health services and be able to impact the children and the families who are being impacted. And if we do that, we change the narrative, we'll be able to change what's going on in our state. Anything short of that, and I don't know if you can speak to it all, but anything short of that is not going to work. I've been doing this work for now 40 years, and in the trenches with the people, developing program and seeing program that works and then turn around and having that program removed. And I'm personally thinking it because it works. So if you have any comment on that, I'd certainly like to hear it, because this is very frustrating for our community, nonprofits in the community, and the children, most importantly, who are being impacted by this.
Yeah, you know, when we look at how did mass incarceration come about, it's a complicated answer, right? And we all know some pieces of it. You know, but one thing that happened was it changed our ideas about where public safety is produced. Where does it come from? You know, if we think about, most of us have the opportunity, the ability, when we raise our kids, we try to get them a good education. We try to get them good summer jobs. We try to have them have good health care. All the things that we think make for a better life, and also mean that our kid's going to be less likely to get involved in criminal activity, and it just makes common sense. And when we look at criminal justice, you know, rather than seeing public safety as a function of all those systems, as well as the criminal justice system, the dialogue has been prison is the answer to those problems, particularly for low-income communities of color. And we've really shifted our attention, our focus in that direction. Now, one initiative of recent years been the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. Connecticut was one of many states that were involved in that. Justice Reinvestment, as it was originally conceived, said, you know, to try to get at this issue, how do we reduce prison populations, save resources, invest those resources in communities where the source of these problems and the source of the solution. As justice reinvestment's played out, it's mostly been within the justice system. And it's done some good things, it made some achievements, it's helped to reduce prison populations, it's strengthened community supervision services, but it hasn't really addressed that original conception that it's not about the justice system, it's about the broader community. So how could we reduce the scale of the justice system and make those reinvestments? Now, it's not an easy thing to do in practical ways. You know, in a legislative body, you can't just take money out of the corrections budget and stick it in preschool education, or at least it's difficult to do that, but you can take money out of prisons and put it in parole supervision. So that's been how things have happened. But whether it's done legislatively or whether it's done through public discussion, I think that's the shift we want to be looking at, so that we don't identify public safety as being primarily prisons or primarily the justice system, but that much bigger conversation about all the elements we need to put together.
Hello, my name is Shanra Lanier. I'm an adult probation officer in Willimantic. And you touched briefly upon the impact of the narratives in the juvenile system for the pre-sentence investigations, and I was wondering if there was any research behind that on the adult side, and if anyone had looked into kind of the racial mix-up for our violations of probations. I
don't know. I mean, I would guess there's not much reason to believe it would be different than the outcomes we saw on the juvenile side, but I can't prove that, and I don't know if there are studies that show that. There have been some recent research done on probation violations and looking at racial dynamics. The Urban Institute in Washington has done some of those, and I think that's on their website. You can take a look at some of that. I believe they found some racial disparity that's unexplained by other factors, although not necessarily dramatic disparity in the jurisdictions that they looked at, but I'd have to review some of that.
Mark, thank you for being here. We'll take a little break and reconvene for panel on racial profiling. Thank you.
Thank you very much.